now for someone with actual talent. And now I ask the Clark family to please come forward to light our flaming chalice. With enthusiasm. Thank you. This is an All Hallows blessing by Jan Richardson. Who live in the spaces between our breathing, in the corner of our vision, in the hollows of our bones, in the chambers of our hearts. Nowhere can they be touched. yet still how they move us, how they move in us, made from the tissue of memory like the veil between the worlds that stirs at the merest breath this night and then is at rest. An All Hallows blessing. We will sing. Our hymn is Soon the Day Will Arrive. It's number 146. This is a lovely hymn, but one that we're not particularly familiar with, so watch Annie. And we join in the words of our unison affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia, y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor, y ayudarnos los unos a los otros. And while you're on your feet, turn and introduce yourself to someone you may not know. Enough of that. Enough. Enough, enough. Stop it. Enough. Enough affection. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to this first parish in Bedford, Unitarian Universalist. Welcome, as always, if you are here for the very first time. Welcome if you have been here forever. If you are new and want to stay in touch, there are blue connection cards in the pews. It is such a gorgeous day today, and you're looking pretty good yourselves. You're looking rather well rested. There hasn't been much opportunity for rest in the last few weeks. There were the Red Sox, and there was last week. And this week doesn't look much better. It's going to be challenging to get our rest. There are a variety of announcements. Some of our youth are off at a Hindu temple this morning in Newton, and at 11:45 we will have a prayerfully brief congregational meeting. It is our semi-annual meeting, and we hope that enough of you will gather so we'll have a quorum at 11:45. Let's see. Oh, I thought one thing we could do is turn to the back of your order of service and let us read in unison Doug Mooter's words. Together. We come together to hold each other up through difficult times. On days when you are feeling intimidated, you can be with people who have courage. When you feel yourself slipping into despair, you can look into the eyes of people who still have hope. We join together because we are stronger that way. Indeed, we are. Thank you, Doug. There will also be a gallery opening at 4 p.m. with Bob Bass's photography upstairs in the Bacon Room. And on Tuesday, we will be voting early and often. And then on Wednesday, there is a discussion at 10 o'clock about the previous day's voting. So if you'd like to come for a post-election conversation, do that on Wednesday morning. Thursday evening at 7 o'clock on the steps in front of the Meeting House on the Town Common, we will have the annual observance of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass when, in 1938, Nazis terrorized Jewish businesses and synagogues. We gather to again affirm that this is no place for hate and to recommit ourselves to speaking up whenever there are threats to our commonwealth. Friday, there will be one of the great innovations in church technology and ways of social media, and of course, I'm referring to an intergenerational spaghetti supper. What a concept, a spaghetti supper. We had one of these last year, and we haven't stopped hearing its praises. And so we're going to have a couple of spaghetti suppers in the course of this year, and one of them will be on Friday. And finally, in a couple of weeks, not next Sunday, but on the 18th, among other things, we will be celebrating Thanksgiving, and we will be welcoming new members. And so our membership book is here in this box, and membership is accomplished by your signing your name to our membership book, and only you can determine if and when you are ever ready for such a radical act. But if and when you are ready, the book is available, and if you have questions about that, please speak with Annie or with me. Welcome, everybody. Jen Johnson.
So ancestors have been on our minds in this season. Ancestors, the people who came before us, the people from whom we come. Annie's going to be reflecting on ancestors later this morning, and I wanted to hear as well. I've been thinking about my own ancestors in these recent days. especially after the events of last week. I've been thinking about my Jewish ancestors who came to this country, especially my grandmother and her 4 siblings and her parents, who came from Poland. First, her father, my great-grandfather, came. He was being threatened in the city of Poland where he lived, and people with power wanted to take his business away from him. He was a glove maker, and he had to get out. And some other people, especially other Jewish people and their allies, helped him get out and come to this country. And after a couple of years, his wife, my great-grandmother Leah, brought her 5 children over, including my great-grandmother Dora, who was about 4 years old. And that's why I'm here in this place, because my ancestors came before me. And I know my great-grandmother's name, Leah Zelhufsky, but I don't know much else about her besides what I just told you. I know from my mom that she wore her hair in a bun and that she spoke Yiddish and not much English, and that she couldn't really speak to her grandchildren because they didn't share the same language, but she liked to hug them and even smell the tops of their heads when she gave them a hug. And that was her way of knowing them and showing them her love. But there are other kinds of ancestors, not just ancestors in our family. We have ancestors in our communities, in our schools, in our country, and here in our faith tradition of Unitarian Universalism. We have grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandmothers who came before us and from whom we come, who made this place possible for us. And I've been thinking about some of those grandmothers too, and great-grandmothers. One of them I'm going to be talking about with a group of our RE students in the 2nd and 3rd grade. We're going to be talking about Olympia Brown. And I'm curious, who here has heard of Olympia Brown before? So several of you, but several of you haven't. She's famous in our Unitarian history and our UU circles because she was the very first woman who was ordained as a minister in any denomination in this country. And so she's an ancestor of mine, someone who helped pave the way for me, a woman who's seeking ordination in our tradition. And she also became pretty famous in history for working for women's rights and suffrage alongside people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But there's another grandmother that's been on my mind, a Unitarian great-grandmother of ours. And I'm wondering how many of you have heard of her. Her name is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Anybody? So just a couple. And I actually learned about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper not through seminary, but when I was a student of literature. She was an African-American woman born free in the North who was educated and went on to become a widely published poet and writer of fiction and a lecturer on the abolitionist circuit, talking about the need to end slavery. She also got involved in the women's rights movement, too, alongside people like Olympia Brown. But we don't know her story as much as we know Olympia Brown's. We know about our ancestors through the stories we tell and pass on. And we don't know about our ancestors from the stories we don't tell, the questions we don't ask. In the 70s and 80s, a group of literary scholars became interested in finding out about the African American women who were writing in the 19th century, and they rediscovered Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And later, through that work, Unitarians came to realize that even though she grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, she became a Unitarian later in her life. She was attracted to our theology, the work of some of our ministers on abolition. And so she's one of our ancestors too. And she also spoke about women's rights and suffrage, but she had a different idea. And she said something that I think is really important that we don't always remember. She was invited to speak at one of the conferences for women, for women's rights in the late 19th century. Susan B. Anthony was there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there. And she sat up on the platform with them. And when it was her turn to speak, she very bravely said this. She said, "You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs," because she believed that we couldn't talk about women's rights to vote without talking about racial oppression and the persistence of inequality for people of color. And she knew that she was most oppressed by her racial identity. And so I think it's so important that we remember her story. We still need her story to help us understand how we move forward to make justice and peace and inclusion in our world. And so I want to encourage you, especially the little ones among us, the younger ones, you have a part to play in our ancestors' stories. And one of the things you can do is ask questions around your dinner table. Ask about your great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers. And when you're hearing lessons about history and the people who came before us, you could think about and ask, what story isn't being told here? Who isn't being represented? Whose story isn't being told? And that's work for all of us to do. And so ends our time for all ages. I would like to invite the kids and their RE leaders to gather, and we will sing you out with Spirit of Life. The words are printed in English and Spanish in your order of service.
morning. I'm Sandy Bozanowski, a member of the Lake Pastoral Care Team, and we pause in our service to share with each other our joys and our concerns and our sorrows. If you'd like to come forward to light a candle, please be brief, and if you'd like to light a candle after the service, I'll remain by the candle stand if you'd like to light one in private. There's room for one more candle here for the spirit within all of us, the light within all of us. And I'll be by the candle stand afterwards if you'd like to light a candle in private.
Let's take a breath together. There is so much grief in our bodies. Grief that lives in our hearts and in our stomachs and in our minds. Grief at the unthinkable losses that come with violence, and grief at the more regular kinds of loss that come with aging and illness. Grief at the challenges of medical diagnoses that will rob us of our senses. Grief at trying to get through another day when we see the headlines in the news. That grief feels so uncomfortable, can be intensely painful, and that grief does come from love. From loving people, good, caring, life-saving people. From loving our own life and loving this world. There is a beautiful quote that our Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker wrote that has been turned into song, and it goes like this: there is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in that love. Let us take another breath together and see if for a moment you can rest in that love, even with the grief. Rest in that love that holds us all. It is strong enough to keep us together and hold us, even in the face of unthinkable things. May we rest in it as often as we are able.
As Chris and Bill said, on Saturday morning, Jerry was with the people he loved in a place he loved, doing the thing he loved. Torah study. Dor Hadash, that congregation, is a small congregation without a rabbi, and there is now a Jerry Rabinowitz fund to hire a rabbi to lead Torah study, and our offering this morning will be shared with that fund. Freely we have received, freely give. For the good work of this congregation within and far, far beyond these walls, our offering will now gratefully be received.
Thank you for your generosity. There are two ancestors in my life that I particularly identify with. And sometimes I like to tell a joke about them that illustrates how I became Unitarian Universalist. What do you get when you cross a devout atheist with a devout Catholic? You get a devout Unitarian Universalist. My paternal grandfather, who is still living, is a devout atheist. He is a stubborn, radical, leftist man. If you were here for Deb Weiner's sermon, you heard a little story about his labor organizing days. And I identify with his fierce fighting spirit and his commitment to political change. I have learned the Spanish language that was the first one he learned in his Cuban family because it wasn't passed down, so I had to learn it in school. And I also identify with my maternal grandmother, who died when I was in college, a quietly devoted Irish Catholic woman who was a nurse and raised 4 children, who did so much of that behind-the-scenes work that women have done and still do. The raising of the kids and the cooking of the food and the supporting of the breadwinning husband. Every Christmas, she would always make this particular kind of toffee, and I truly think it is the best candy in the whole wide world. And my grandpa would bring it in little baggies to everyone in his workplace at the newspaper where he worked, and everyone looked forward to it every year. And I identify with her gentle compassion and quiet devotion. I think that somehow I intuited that a connection to ancestors is spiritually vital. In addition to drawing on these two figures and naming them in my formation as a faith leader, I also spent a summer when I was doing my clinical pastoral education, which is where people becoming ministers do a chaplaincy internship. And I was working in a hospital as a hospital chaplain. And I was living with my parents because they don't pay you to do this, and I had to have somewhere to live that was free. And so I had some free time, and I started to spend that free time doing research into our family tree and learning about my genealogy, which was interesting because while I identify very strongly with the radical Cuban side and the Irish Catholic side, I'm actually mostly German. But that's how it is with stories, right? You learn the stories that were passed down to you. I think somehow I intuited how important it was to connect with my ancestors, even though I didn't have a cultural practice I inherited around ancestors. Now, there's many cultures all throughout the world that do have very specific ancestor practices. Maybe there are altars that are set out all the time or on certain holidays. Some make offerings of tangible items like food and money to the ancestors. Some pray to the ancestors. But as a white woman, and particularly a white woman coming from a sort of secular Protestantish milieu, I did not inherit a tradition like this. And I think that is often true for white folks. One of the lies that come with the way whiteness was invented and created in this culture is that we are just individuals, neutral, without culture or past, not dependent on or responsible for those who came before. And I think this lie about whiteness can be a barrier for white people in engaging with our ancestors on a spiritual level. But it is a key spiritual practice. I think by engaging with our ancestors, we can more fully understand our inheritance And by fully accepting the gifts and challenges of our inheritance, we are better able to heal ourselves and better able to heal the world. Now, as Jen said during the Time for All Ages, there are many kinds of ancestors, and while I shared a couple of my biological ancestors, I know that not everyone knows who their biological ancestors are. Some people are adopted. Others are in families where the stories just weren't passed on for whatever reason. But we do have cultural ancestors, ancestors who paved the way for us in our work, ancestors from our spiritual tradition. And so whether biological, adoptive, chosen, cultural, spiritual, these ancestors are part of who we are. Now, engaging with this aspect of ourselves has many positive qualities to it. There's gratitude, like the gratitude that Jen talked about, gratitude for her ancestors who got through horrible situations, gratitude to people like Olympia Brown who paved the way for women like me to be ordained. There can be a strengthened sense of identity, like I talked about, identifying with radical politics and religious devotion through my ancestors. And there is also a really key aspect around belonging. I think that belonging is one of the most key things that human beings need, a sense that we belong to community. And it is very important to have that community connection with people in the here and now that we can relate to directly. But when we connect to our ancestors, it's like we also have a community through time. And that is another key aspect to belonging. Now, some people can find belonging more easily in society than others, and I count myself among those. But for those who do not find belonging quite so easily, this ancestry connection can be even more important. It brings to mind this man I knew in seminary, a gay black man who was an elder in the black gay community, and he would often talk about his sons. Now, these were not biological or adopted sons. These were his gay sons that he mentored and supported, many of whom had been cast out by their biological families or by their church community for their identity. And they had another ancestry to move into and find in this tradition of having sons in this particular community in New York. So there are many positive things we can inherit from our ancestors, and there is a way to belonging there. But as we know, we don't only inherit positive things. Belonging is a gift, but we also inherit their pain and their trauma. I imagine many of you know all too well the ways that interpersonal or systemic trauma can impact generations to come. There have been studies done about this. A couple studies that I saw in preparing for this sermon addressed adult children of Holocaust survivors and adult children of Cambodian refugees. And they had a study that showed that those adult children are much more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms if their parents had had post-traumatic stress disorder from these experiences. Now, there's a lot of theories on how this works. Some scientists believe there's an in utero aspect that contributes genetically to someone's makeup. And then there's also, of course, the way that culture and behavior can transmit coping mechanisms and ways of engaging with the world. So what does this have to do with healing? Well, I'm definitely not an expert, and I'm sure that there are whole entire books on healing from intergenerational trauma. But from what I understand, there are two main aspects to this, and that is acknowledging the story and the pain, and then expanding around it. Now, in some families and cultural traditions, there is an avoidance of what was hard in the past. And that's a coping mechanism, and it's very understandable. And it also can make healing more difficult. It is important that we actually understand the trauma and acknowledge it in order to heal. There was some research at universities that show that having an awareness of transgenerational stories facilitate resilience. And this was explored both after September 11th attacks in New York and also after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And the results suggested that individuals who knew more about their family's ancestry and past were better able to manage the effects of these traumatic events. But what about when you don't know? When you're adopted or people really just didn't talk about it? Well, there's other ways like research, of course, and in our day and age of information, there's many ways to do that. But I think even just being open to the idea that maybe some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms you've acquired are inherited from generational trauma, even just that realization can make some space for healing. And then there's the expanding, creating a more full narrative. This horrific thing happened, and we got through it. This thing happened, and I have the power to choose a new reaction in my generation. This thing happened, and there is powerful love in the universe. This thing happened, and I can fight today so that things like that don't happen to future generations. Avoiding the trauma completely or over-fixating on the trauma are not the best paths to healing, but acknowledging it and acknowledging the pain while building around it with additional pieces of the story can indeed help to heal future generations. Which, of course, brings us to healing the world for future generations. Because while we all have ancestors who endured trauma, many of us also have ancestors who perpetuated harm. And while we all inherit some challenges from our ancestors, many of us also inherit privileges from our ancestors and what they did. Yesterday, I was reading an article in preparation for this sermon called "The Man Who Launched the GOP's Civil War: How a Textile Magnate Turned the Party of Lincoln into the Party of Trump." This article was about an exceedingly rich, ruthlessly sly, virulently anti-union inheritor of one of America's largest privately owned companies. This man was Roger Milliken, and he and I both benefit from the wealth of the same ancestor, Seth Milliken, whose money pays for Moira Gonzalez Milliken to go to preschool. You see, Seth Milliken had an offspring later down the line named Scott Milliken, who has a son named Lucas Milliken, who I married. And if you, again, are familiar with the story of my paternal grandfather, you'll know that my people that I identify with are Union people, and Roger Milliken is a man who literally economically destroyed an entire town in South Carolina to punish people for forming a union at one of his plants. What do I do with that? I don't want to share ancestors with this man. But the fact of the matter is that I benefit from that Milliken wealth. And it helps us to be able to afford our life because this trust fund we inherited is a trust fund for education, and it means that my husband had no student loans in college, and it means that our daughter can go to private preschool for free. One of the things we try to do to be accountable to that inheritance is to give generously. And I checked our You Need a Budget app before I planned this sermon to make sure that we actually were doing that. And according to our You Need a Budget app, which I highly recommend if anyone is looking for a budget app, by the way, excellent budget app, it says that in the past year, 22% of our budget went to generosity and justice. And I felt like that was pretty good. And I felt like we were doing something to be accountable to our inheritance. And the thing is that it can be easy to get mixed up in guilt around ancestors like that. And not all of us are related to families like the Millikens, but probably many of us have ancestors somewhere back there who exploited the labor of others. Probably we have ancestors back there who had roles in perpetuating harm, war, slavery, things of this nature. And so those who have inherited privilege from these kinds of acts in the past, we don't need to feel guilty about it because we didn't do it. But we still have a key role to play in leveraging our inheritance towards the greater good. And so where do we get the strength for this work in times like these? The violence keeps coming. The systemic violence and the interpersonal violence, the violence of our government, it just doesn't stop. And on top of that, there's the fact that climate change is very likely to make human life impossible somewhere down the line in the not so distant future. So what do we do with that? How do we not just lay down and give up? Well, there are many ways. One of them is the coming together that we read on the back of the order of service. And another is to remember our ancestors. Sometimes I like to remember that I have ancestors in my lineage who survived war, who survived poverty, who survived famine. Somewhere in my ancestry are indigenous people from the island of Cuba who survived colonization. All throughout my ancestry are women who survived much more brutal forms of patriarchy than the one that I have to face. And I know that this is true for all of you, too. You have ancestors who survived impossible circumstances so that you could exist. As the quote on the order of service says, watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands. Your people survived. Your people loved. And you are here. That is a miracle. That wild and precious life that was lifted up in the candles, that is a miracle. And in your DNA is the DNA of incredibly strong survivors. So whether you already have or you start an altar practice, whether you already have or start a family tree, whether you already have or start reading about those who paved ways for you, or whether you take time to sit in quiet meditation with an open heart to receive wisdom from those who came before, we can draw on these practices. We can honor our ancestors to heal ourselves and to heal this world. because they live in us. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. Will you join me in singing our closing hymn? It is in our teal hymnal. For each child that's born, we are. All the grief and pain in this world, grounded in that knowledge that we are miracles of love and can do and survive so much. May it be so.